Right now, you can scroll any brokerage site and see something crazy. A 40-something foot catamaran that would have sold for over $500,000 in 2021, now sitting at anchor for months at $350,000, then $320,000, then make offer. Some are under $250,000. On paper, it looks like the Liveaboard deal of the decade. But is it? Is this the perfect moment to grab a cheap catamaran and move aboard, or are you about to inherit someone else's financial emergency? That is exactly what we're going to break down in this video. We'll look at why catamaran prices are dropping, which cheap cats are actually smart buys, which ones are underwater traps, and what it really costs to live aboard in 2025. And if you stick around to the end, I'll give you a simple 10-question cheap catamaran filter you can run on any listing to decide in 5 minutes whether it's worth chasing or you should walk away. If you want more no BS breakdowns like this, hit subscribe and tap the bell so YouTube actually shows you the next deep dive. Let's get into it. First, what is actually happening to catamaran prices right now? During the pandemic years 2020 to 2022, the catamaran market went insane. Charter companies were desperate for inventory. Private buyers wanted their own floating quarantine. Interest rates were low, stock portfolios were high, and everyone with a cruising dream wanted a boat at the same time. Good cats were selling above asking. Ex-charter boats with 8,000 hours and tired interiors were receiving multiple offers. People waived surveys. Some owners who bought before COVID could resell a used cat for more than they paid new. That party is over. By late 2024 and into 2025, 3 big things changed. 1. Interest rates. Financing a $500,000 cat at 3 or 4% is not the same as financing at 8 or 9. Monthly payments jumped by hundreds or thousands of dollars. A big slice of the middle-class buyer pool disappeared almost overnight. 2. Insurance. After years of storm losses and rising repair costs, insurers tightened the screws. Older boats, boats in hurricane zones, and models with known structural issues suddenly became hard or impossible to insure. If a buyer can't get insurance, they usually can't get a loan, and some marinas won't even let you dock without liability coverage. That makes certain boats effectively unsellable at any price that makes sense for the seller. 3. Inventory. The COVID fleet is coming back to market. People who bought a catamaran as a pandemic escape are now back at work, their kids are back in school, or they discovered they don't actually like fixing toilets in paradise.
At the same time, charter fleets are finally refreshing boats they held on to longer than usual. That means a wall of ex-charter inventory hitting the market in the 40 to 50-foot range. The result is what we're seeing now. Long days on market, aggressive price cuts, and a lot of sellers who are quietly very motivated. So yes, on the surface, now is a much better time to buy than 2021. But cheap catamaran can mean very different things. Let's talk about the 4 main types you'll see, because only 1 or 2 of them might deserve your money. First category, discounted but fundamentally sound late-model cats. These are the ex-charter Lagoons, Fountain Peugeots, Leopards, and Balis from around 2015 to 2020. They used to be the backbone of the charter fleets. You see a Lagoon 42 that would have been listed for $550,000 during the boom, now at $380,000. Or a Leopard 45 ex-moorings boat that's fallen from the mid-600s into the low 400s. On paper, this is the sweet spot. They're modern, insurable, reasonably safe layouts with parts and knowledge available everywhere. They come with big solar arrays, water makers, extra heads, and the kind of gear long-term cruisers actually use. But the downside is miles and hours. Charter boats work hard. 8,000 engine hours, worn sail drives, patched sails, cabinetry that's lived through years of sunscreen and charter cooking, stress on bulkheads and rigging, and sometimes quick cosmetic refits to make things look nice while the structural stuff is untouched. If you're considering one of these, the price gap between ex-charter and privately owned is your margin for refit. If a private use owner's version is $550,000 and the ex-charter is $380,000, that $170,000 delta is not profit. It's your budget for engines, rigging, sales, electronics, cosmetic refresh, and a big survey punch list. Second category, older production cats from the late 1990s and early 2000s. Think early Lagoons, Privileges, Prouts, some Dean and Broad Blue models, maybe older Fountain Peugeots. These can show up in the $150,000 to $300,000 range, sometimes less. The upside, simpler systems, lighter displacement, often better sailing performance than the floating condos built for the modern charter trade. The downside, age. Osmosis, window leaks, tired rigging, outdated electrical systems, delaminating balsa coring, and in some models, structural issues the market knows about. Insurance companies see a 25-year-old cat and immediately start asking for rig reports, moisture readings, and expensive hull-out surveys. Sometimes they simply say no. This is where cheap catamaran can blend into uninsurable catamaran. If you're planning to liveaboard and cruise internationally, that matters.
Third category, project and semi-abandoned cats. You'll find these on classifieds, not always with brokers. Sometimes they're older, all-foam boats that have sat for years. Sometimes they're storm-damaged hulls or half-finished owner builds that ran out of money. The asking prices can look incredibly tempting, 5 figures instead of 6. The idea of, I'll fix it up as I live aboard and save a fortune, is very common. Here's the truth. Unless you are bringing serious boat-building skills, lots of time, and the ability to live cheaply somewhere with a yard that will let you work on your own boat, these are almost never the best path into liveaboard life. By the time you add hull repairs, a new rig, new standing and running rigging, sails, engines, electronics, plumbing, safety gear, and interior work, you can easily pour $200,000 into a boat you bought for $60,000 and still end up with something worth less than a well-chosen ex-charter at $280,000. Fourth category, the paper-cheap but financially toxic cat. These are boats with major insurance or title problems. Maybe they're older than insurers like. Maybe they had a known structural issue like the bulkhead problems on some Lagoon 450s that weren't properly repaired. Maybe they're flagged in a hurricane claim database or sitting in high-risk hurricane zones where fewer insurers want to play. You'll see a big, comfortable cat for a surprisingly low price, but if the only way to keep it is to self-insure, haul it every season, and find a private dock because marinas won't take an uninsured hull, the true cost is way beyond the sticker. So with all that in mind, let's come back to the question. Is now the time to buy a cheap catamaran and move aboard? The answer depends less on the market and more on you. Let's start with why you want a catamaran for liveaboard life in the first place. Cats are brilliant as floating apartments. You get a wide, stable platform at anchor, no rolling every time a powerboat goes past. Huge cockpit and salon spaces that are all on one level. That makes life feel much less like camping and more like living in a small, weirdly shaped condo. Separation of spaces, one hull for sleeping, one for office or guests. Great for couples working remotely. Shallow draft. You can sneak into bays and anchorages monohulls can't use, which is valuable when anchorages are crowded or marinas are full and expensive. But the trade-offs are real. You have 2 hulls to maintain, not 1. 2 engines, 2 sail drives and sets of running gear, more through hulls, more plumbing, more deck area to keep sealed, more expensive rigging because the loads are higher.
And your marina costs are often charged by beam, not length, which means you can be paying 1.5 to 2 times a monohull for the same length. So the first question is, what kind of liveaboard are you planning to be? If your vision is marina condo with occasional day sails, the math is very different from off-grid cruiser, mostly on anchor, with short seasons in marinas. If you plan to live mostly at anchor or on a mooring, fuel and maintenance are your big variable costs. If you plan to sit in a slip in Florida or the Med full-time, berthing quickly becomes your biggest line item. Let's run some very simple numbers for a typical, cheap catamaran scenario. Say you find a 2008 to 2012 X-Charter Lagoon 380 or 400 listed at $230,000, down from the mid-300s a few years ago. You negotiate well and buy at $210,000. You pay cash or you finance part of it. Either way, your capital is committed. Then you factor in survey and haul-out, sales tax or VAT if applicable, insurance if you can get it, maybe $5,000 to $8,000 a year, more in high-risk zones, marina or mooring fees. Let's call it $800 a month on average over a year, assuming some anchoring and some time in slips. In a busy area, that could easily be more. Maintenance and upgrades. A very conservative rule of thumb for older cruising cats is around 10% of the boat's value per year in maintenance and improvements once you're actually using it. On a $210,000 boat, that's $21,000 a year or $1,750 a month. All in, a lot of couples living aboard a cheap cat will see fixed and semi-fixed costs in the $2,500 to $4,000 per month range before food, flights, and fun. You can drive that down by anchoring more, doing your own work, and being in cheaper regions. But the order of magnitude is the same. The big insight is this: the cash price of the cat is only one piece. A cheap boat that needs another $100,000 over 3 years just to be safe and livable is not a cheap boat. So how do you tell whether a cheap catamaran is a smart liveaboard platform or a disguised refit project? Next up, let's talk about the specific red flags to look for on listings, and then we'll get to that 10-question filter at the end. Red flag 1. Vague or missing engine information. On a liveaboard cat, your engines are your second home. You want hour readings, service history, and ideally recent work on things like injectors, alternators, and cooling systems. If a listing just says, twin diesels run great, low hours, with no numbers, that's a sign the seller doesn't have the records or doesn't want to put them in writing.
Most insurers now want standing rigging under about 10 years old, sometimes 15 if the boat has been in easy waters and surveyed well. Re-rigging a catamaran is not cheap. You're dealing with longer wire, big loads, specialized fittings, and often a yard period. If the rig is original and the boat is over 15 years old, you should mentally subtract the full cost of a re-rig from the asking price plus a cushion for surprises. Red flag 3. Deck leaks and soft spots. Cats have huge flat deck areas with lots of hatches and big windows. Leaks are common. On some models, particularly early balsa cord boats, water intrusion can lead to core rot that is expensive to fix. If the broker language mentions some leaks around windows or needs some cosmetic work on deck, take that seriously. Once moisture gets into the core, around chain plates or high-load fittings, you're into structural territory. Red flag 4. Known design or structural issues not addressed. Every production catamaran line has its known quirks: Lagoon 450 bulkhead cracking, early FP models with under-designed rudder bearings, some bridges that slam and chop and have been patched. What you want to see is a listing that says this known issue has been proactively addressed with yard documentation. If the boat is in the problem model group and there's no mention of repairs, assume you might inherit the issue. Red flag 5. The wrong kind of refit. Fresh upholstery and new countertops are lovely, but they don't keep the rig in the boat. If the listing brags about a new interior, underwater lights, and a big TV, but the sails are 10 years old and the electronics are original, that's someone spending money on resale photos rather than reliability. As a Liveaboard, you want the opposite: boring new rigging, sails, and systems, ugly cushions you can change later for cheap. Red flag 6. Unclear paperwork or flags. Many cats have complex histories, built in France, sailed under a Caribbean flag, imported into the US or EU, maybe chartered, maybe privately owned. You need clarity on VAT status, registration, any outstanding liens, and whether the boat is actually where the paperwork says it is. If the broker cannot clearly explain the boat's legal and tax situation, walk. A paperwork mess can sink you before you ever leave the dock. Red flag 7. Impossible insurance quotes. Before you fall in love, get a preliminary view from a marine insurance broker. Give them the boat's age, model, hull material, where you plan to cruise, and your sailing resume. If they come back with, no one wants to write full coverage on that boat in that region, believe them.
You can sometimes negotiate or change your cruising grounds to get coverage, but you can't force a market that has decided a type of boat is too risky. So with all that on the table, who should seriously consider buying a cheap catamaran right now? Profile 1. the cash-rich, time-rich couple or family who want to cruise full-time. If you have enough cash to buy the boat outright, fund a solid refit, and still keep an emergency reserve, the current market is in your favor. You can negotiate hard on price, move quickly on the right hull, and you're not as exposed to interest rate risk. You still need to respect insurance and running costs, but you've got flexibility. Profile 2. Remote workers planning to live aboard, mostly at anchor. If your plan is to anchor in safe, low-cost areas, manage your own maintenance, and dip into marinas mainly for weather and logistics, a well-chosen cheap cat can absolutely be cheaper than a house in many Western cities. You still need a realistic budget, but you're using the boat as a small off-grid apartment that can occasionally move, not a marina condo in the most expensive harbor in the region. Profile 3. People who have already lived aboard or owned boats before. If this is not your first rodeo, you are much better positioned to filter listings, evaluate maintenance, and tell the difference between cosmetic and structural problems. You know what a build should smell like, and you know when a surveyor is being too casual. Who should be very cautious? Anyone trying to stretch. If you're looking at a cheap cat at the very top of your budget, planning to finance almost all of it, and hoping that chartering it out or renting cabins to digital nomads will cover the payments, this is a dangerous moment to jump. Markets are soft, charter competition is strong, regulations around running informal charters are tighter. The people who get hurt the worst in corrections are the ones who bought at the edge of their means assuming everything would go right. Also, be cautious if you secretly hate DIY and problem solving. Liveaboard life on a catamaran, even a modern one, is a constant flow of small and medium-sized problems to solve. If that sounds like a nightmare and you just want a floating hotel, ownership might not be the right path. Charter more, own less. We've covered a lot, so let's pull it together into the promised 10-question cheap catamaran filter. The idea is simple. Anytime you see a tempting listing, run through these in your head. If you hit too many red flags, move on. Question 1. What's the true all-in price, not just the asking price? Add estimated tax, transport if needed, survey and haul out, a realistic initial refit budget, and 1 year of running costs.
If that total number makes you nauseous, the boat is not cheap for you. Question 2. How old are the engines and how many hours do they have? Under, say, 3,000 well-documented hours on well-maintained diesels is very different from 8,000 hours with missing records. Price accordingly. Question 3. How old is the standing rigging? If it's older than 10 years or unknown, assume you need to re-rig and subtract that cost from what you're willing to pay. Question 4. When were the sails last replaced and what's in the inventory? For liveboard cruising, you want a decent main, a headsail, and ideally some way to sail downwind without beating yourself up. Worn-out sails are slow and frustrating, and new ones are not cheap. Question 5. What does the last survey say? Best case, you see a recent, thorough survey with photos and a punch list that's been addressed. Worst case, no one has hauled the boat in years and you're going in blind. If the seller refuses to share any past survey info at all, that's data. Question 6. Can you get proper insurance for your plan? Not just liability. Ask an actual marine insurance broker what they expect, what surveys they'll require, and what your premium might be. If the answer is maybe liability only, maybe nothing, that's a different decision than, yes, full coverage available if you do X and Y. Question 7. Where will you keep it and what does that cost? Do you already have a slip or mooring lined up? How much? Are there hurricane haul-out requirements? It makes no sense to steal a deal on the boat and then get crushed by marina fees you didn't budget for. Question 8. Does the layout really fit how you plan to live? 4-cabin charter layouts sound great on paper, but if it's mostly 2 of you living aboard, an owner's version with one entire hull as your cabin and office may be worth paying more for. You can't refit your way into a completely different layout easily. Question 9. What's the worst-case refit story for this model? Spend an hour reading owner forums about that specific make and year. What are the ugly stories? Bulkheads? Core rot? Rudder failures? If those are expensive and common and your specific boat shows early signs, you need to be either very brave or very compensated on price. Question 10. If you walked away tomorrow, would there be 3 similar boats to look at? This one is about scarcity. If the boat you're eyeing is rare, well-maintained, and exactly what you want, maybe it's worth leaning in a bit. If the market is flooded with that same model at similar or better prices, you have the power. Don't let FOMO push you into a rushed survey and a bad decision. So, is now the time to buy a cheap catamaran and move aboard?
For the right person, with cash, patience, and realistic expectations, the answer can absolutely be yes. The market is shifted. Sellers are no longer in control. There are real opportunities to buy good boats at rational prices again. But cheap is not just about the number on the listing. It's about the whole life of that boat with you on it. Insurance, moorage, refits, time, energy, and stress. If you do the homework, ask the boring questions, and use tools like that 10-question filter, you give yourself a much better shot at stepping onto a catamaran that feels like freedom, not a floating financial anchor. If this helped you think more clearly about the Liveaboard catamaran dream, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive. I'll trade you hype for honest checklists every time. Now, go open your favorite listing site, pick 3 cheap cats you've been eyeing, and run them through the filter. One of them might still be worth a call. The others? Let them be someone else's lesson.